Some of my viewers have asked me to do a video covering two pieces of equipment I use when I'm engraving, one of which is the water dripper and the other is the jig I use for holding the glass in place. So that's what I'll cover today. First, I'll talk about the water dripper. And the first question there is, why do we use water when we're engraving on glass? And there are three main reasons that I'm aware of. The first is that when you are using a diamond burr in particular, using a little water helps to reduce the wear on that burr. It lubricates a little bit, I suppose, between the glass and the burr. It prevents heat build-up and it makes the burr last quite a lot longer. The second one is maybe just my opinion, you may agree or disagree, but I think that when you use water with a diamond burr, the engraving is a little bit smoother when you're finished. There's a little bit less chipping around the edges and it just gives a slightly better result. But the third reason is probably the most important one, because using water reduces the amount of glass dust that gets in the air, and you don't want to be breathing in any glass dust. That's why at the start of all my videos it says that you must wear a mask when you're engraving. But another way of reducing the dust is by keeping the surface of the glass wet, and then the dust turns into a slurry with the water and runs off the glass. So those are the main reasons I would use a water dripper. Now, if it happens that you don't have a water dripper or want a water dripper, there are a couple of other things you can do. You could keep a little dish of water at one side and a little piece of sponge, and every so often dip the sponge into the water, wipe that over the engraving, and that will clear away any dust and also lubricate the surface of the glass. The other thing you could do is keep an old spray bottle, fill it up with water and spray that onto the work every so often. Both of those work perfectly well. The only downside with both of those methods is you have to stop your engraving for a second or two while you do it, and it gets to be a bit annoying after a while. So for that reason I decided I would make myself a water dripper. Now, of course, I am Scottish, and therefore I am bound by hundreds of years of tradition and history, as well as by personal inclination, to not spend any money if I don't have to. So the water dripper system I made is as cheap as I could possibly make it. The water dripper works with a siphon system, and you'll know that for a siphon you need to start with a reservoir of water which is at a higher level than where you want the water to drip out at the bottom. And my reservoir is just an old plastic bottle, nothing fancier than that. The only thing I've done with this that might be a little bit different is I cut a little opening here, and that's purely so when it comes time for me to fill it up, I can pour the water in there and I don't have to mess about taking the lid off and putting a funnel in or something like that so I could fill it up. So I can pour the water in there to fill it up quickly, and it just hangs up above my workbench, and that gives me my reservoir of water. The second thing you need for any siphon system is some sort of tube. You may have something lying about the house, but if not, what I did was I went and got some, this is air tubing from an aquarium. You can get it from a local pet shop, and it's really quite inexpensive. You get more than enough in a packet to do you a water dripper. It's not too thick, it just carries quite a nice amount of water, and it's quite easy to work with. So aquarium air tubing is a good way to go, but if you have another piece of tube that already, then feel free to use it. You know, something that you might use for siphoning, I don't know, petrol out of the neighbours' cars, or don't do that. But any kind of plastic tubing works. Now, I happen also to have some of this straight tubing, which is quite useful because I can use that, tape it down, and then that gives me a straight piece to put in here, so that the bottom of the tube goes right down to the bottom of the reservoir. If you don't have that, You'll notice this stuff comes, it's all curled up, and it always wants to stay curled up. But if you warm it up in a little bit of hot water, just pour some water out of the kettle into a container, heat it up a little bit, stretch it out, and then cool it down in some cold water, it'll tend to straighten out a bit for you. And you can use the same technique if you want to put a little bend in it. Heat it up in a little warm water, get it to the bend that you want, try not to put a kink into it, and then cool it down again, and it'll tend to stay in that shape. So that's your tuber. Now, if all we had was a reservoir of water and a tube, then when you set your siphon going by sucking on the end to suck some of the water into it, all that water would just run out at the bottom, and it would run out very quickly, and that's not much use to us. To stop that happening, you need some sort of a tap. And this little tap is designed to work with aquarium air tubing. And I got that at the pet shop at the same time as I got the tube. And it's very simple little plastic tap. Attach your tube on that end, and you can attach another bit of tube on this end so that you've got something to hold in your hand or extend out over the work. And then that tap lets you adjust the rate of flow of the water, so it can be running quite fast or just dripping very slowly, depending on what you want. In my experience, these taps, they are very, very cheap, and obviously they're not, wonderfully engineered things, they're just a little bit of plastic. I find that it's best when you're making this to set it up so that the tap is below the level of the reservoir, rather than having it, say, up here. I find that if I don't do that, what happens is that a lot of air gets sucked in here, and then the siphon doesn't work particularly well. So that's the only other tip I would give you about setting up a water dripper. But they're very, very inexpensive to make, and honestly it's about 15 minutes work. There's not a lot to it. Once it's set up, I will normally engrave holding the water dripper in my left hand whilst I'm working on the glass. Sometimes I do have a bit of wire screwed onto the wall of the workshop so that I can run the tube along there and have it just drip onto the glass without me holding onto it, but quite a lot of the time I end up just holding onto it. And that's really all there is to a water dripper. It's not an expensive thing to make, it's very quick to make, and it's easy. The other thing I was asked about was the wooden jig that I use to hold the glass while I am engraving it. Now this wooden jig, the wooden holder that I use, again, is not anything fancy. It's a little more complicated to make than the water dripper, but if you can saw some wood and drill a couple of holes, you'll manage fine. Now you'll see here it's very simply made with a couple of strips of wood, a couple of pieces of wood that I've cut to size, and these threaded bars, which I bought at our local hardware DIY shop, and I got quite a long length, and it wasn't very expensive. To make this, all that I did was I drilled a couple of holes in the bottom. Now it happens that I put a nut on the bottom to hold it, but you could just as easily drill the hole and then put in something like a 2-part epoxy resin and glue the bars in there. And then in the top piece of wood there are holes drilled all the way through, which let this top piece move up and down in the jig. I suppose the only tip I would give you, and one I should have known myself when I made this, is make these holes big enough so that the wood can move up and down fairly easily and it doesn't tend to bind onto the threaded rod. Now you could stop with that, just the 2 pieces of wood and the threaded rod, and just have it laying flat on a work surface. But I did put a back onto this. There's a flat piece along the back which I painted black just to help support the work when I'm working on it. And actually this is it's a piece of an old rubber mat from a car which slips in there quite nicely, and it makes it nice and soft for the glass to sit against. I do have little wing nuts up on here, which you could use to sort of clamp the wood down on top of the piece of work, but actually they're a bit of a pain in the neck. It takes a long time to wind them up and down the rod, so I tend not to use those, and I find that really there's enough friction against the rubber mat to hold this top bar in place while I work on the glass. So that's really all there is to it. A few offcuts of wood and the threaded rod. Now as far as the wood goes, this happens to be oak because I happened to have some offcuts of oak that I could use. It does not need to be oak, it does not need to be a hardwood. You can use the softwood, pine or spruce. What you probably can't use would be things like chipboard or MDF or some manufactured wood like that, because this is going to stay wet a lot of the time, and those things, if you keep them wet, they expand and tend to fall apart. So, but any kind of solid wood will work fine for this. The only other thing I have done with this, if you've watched any of my videos, you'll have seen my workbenches in the back of my cold, dark and miserable garage, and the garage has no windows. There's no natural light in there. And if you do any engraving, you'll know that lighting is really important to show up the engraving as you're working on it. So to get round that, the only other thing I've done with this, which I think probably 99% of people will never need to do, is I've actually fitted a little light in here. Now this, before you start panicking about having a light in a wet environment like this particular light is actually an aquarium light. So it's designed to work, it's actually designed to be submerged if necessary, that one, but I don't ever get quite that wet. So what I did to help me was I cut a little recess there, I fitted the light up into it, and if I turn that on, oh, there we go. What that does is it shines light directly into the work and it helps to show it up. But as I say, if you have, good lighting in the area you're working in, you will never need anything like that. 99% of people will never need anything like that. But it works quite nicely for me because of the situation I'm working in. There we have it. One water dripper made for very little money, very quickly, very easily. And one jig, also made for very little money, takes a little bit longer and a little bit of know-how with a saw and a drill, but other than that, not a big problem. And these are things I find very useful when I'm engraving. If this video has been useful to you, and if you're not subscribed yet, then please go ahead and click that subscribe button. If you like it, then click the thumbs up. If you don't like it and decide to click the thumbs down, please leave me a comment and let me know what it is that you didn't like about it, and I'll try and do better next time. But for the moment, that's all I have to say today, so thank you very much for watching. Hope you all have a nice day and enjoy your engraving.